it's almost as if pastors have little chance anymore. They get the people once or twice a week. And Fox News is playing literally all day in some of these households. So people are being formed, this kind of political Christian nationalist kind of way by the media they consume, and thus it's going to require pastors to have some degree of courage.
Welcome to the J29 podcast, hosting conversations for American pastors about politics and culture in their preaching, discipleship, and mentoring. Visit j29coalition.com for more information.
John, I have really benefited from your work over the years, especially thinking for me as a pastor about American history and religion. And I also, you just shared with me before we started recording that you're in a season of a bit of a transition out of Messiah and into the Lumen Center. Would you tell us about that?
Sure. I taught American history at Messiah for almost 25 years. My wife, Joy, also worked at Messiah for just about that amount of time in running in the Career Center, Internship Center, those kinds of things. And sort of did some women's ministry at our church. And she landed for her the job of a lifetime here in Madison, Wisconsin, as part of the leadership team of Upper House, which is the Christian Study Center. I don't know how familiar your listeners might be with the Christian Study Center movement. These are centers on campus that kind of, you have your InterVarsity and your crew and your, navigators and those kinds of things. The Christian Study Center movement is trying to kind of take that up a notch, sort of a more intellectual, more kind of academic kind of way to get college students to think about relating their faith to their callings, their vocations, their majors, those kinds of things. Almost like a little Christian college here in the middle of a major research university. So she got that job. She's head of programming. And they also started under the direction of Dan Hummel, who some of your listeners may know wrote a great book on dispensationalism, history book. He's a UW historian, trained historian. Started the Lumen Center, which is, for lack of a better term, a kind of think tank for scholars, faith-based scholars, to kind of think about how to bridge the gap between the university and the church. So I'm involved with kind of that wing of the Upper House Christian Study Center movement here. So we've uprooted, we've moved to Madison. I've retired as of the end of June 2026 from Messiah. Still be an emeritus professor, so I'll still have that connection. But yeah, that's what I'm doing now. It's very exciting, and I don't really. It's kind of a retirement project, but I just turned 60, so I still got some good years left in me.
Yeah, oh, that's great, man. Well, I'm excited to see how that bears fruit in the years to come. John, we're recording this in the year of our Lord 2026, which, if I'm doing the math correctly, about 250 years ago was 1776, which someone told me was a really important date for America.
Yeah, some might say. Adam Smith published Wealth of Nations. That's the important.
That's what it is. Of course. Yeah, that's exactly what I said. There was also something else that happened. For those of us that pastor and minister in America here in our 250th birthday, we're also thinking about our history, not just pastoring today, but those who've come before us. And certainly there's been pastors who have engaged in different parts of forming America, speaking into things like the Revolutionary War. And yet, I think for many evangelical American pastors, there's a bit of a gap in understanding our history and how Christian leaders in the church have been a part of that. Why do you think it's important for pastors, in particular in America, to understand our history?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is a huge conversation, obviously, as you point out, Caleb, this year. Because history is all about, especially kind of history of nations, history of countries, like we're celebrating this year. it's all about kind of national identity, right? Who we are as a people. And who we are as a people, or who we think we are as a people, is going to shape the way we govern ourselves, the policies that we want to pass, the points of emphasis that we want to make. It's going to shape sort of social and cultural agendas in our country, right? So, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the role of religion and specifically Christianity in the founding, and I think if you really want to understand the culture wars that we're engaged in right now, you need to understand something about American history and use the past responsibly in your engagement with, the present, your social, cultural, political kind of stances, your ecclesiastical, what goes on in your church, right? How you think about politics in your church. So all of this is the roots and foundation of all of our culture war debates really come down to sort of who we are as a nation. And then for Christians, and especially Christian pastors, right, how are you going to use the founding responsibly as you think about the 250th, or really at any time when you think about politics? And then even a larger question, right? Just how much does the discipline of history or the study of the past really help us in thinking about contemporary debates? The last time I checked, James Madison was not writing about, prayers at the 50-yard line in high school football games, right? So this is a huge question about how the past relates to the present, and we don't talk about that too much in this 250th year, because everybody is looking for our sort of natural inclination, the great historian Sam Weinberg at Stanford said, our psychological condition at rest is to find something usable in the past, right? Something we can use to advance an agenda, whatever that agenda might be, in the present. Both sides of the political aisle do this. Christians do this. Non-Christians do this, right? It's our natural inclination, to do this. So, we're all in search of a usable past, and, historians are kind of wanting to always think about, what really happened in that period, right? Apart from, as best as we can, apart from kind of the political, cultural debates of the present. And what we find then is that history can be really, really messy. And sometimes it's useful in the present, and sometimes it's not, or sometimes it's just way too complicated to make huge jumps from here we are here we were in the 18th century as a new republic to like our current pluralistic society that we live in. So this whole question that I've spent a lot of time exploring, was America founded as a Christian nation? That's a historical question, but it's also a really bad historical question, because I would argue that, that's, how about that, an author saying the title of his book is a bad title, but it is. That was what the publisher meant. That was not my original title. My title was much more boring. It's like Religion and the American Founding or something like that. But I probably sold more books because of that title. But it's a bad historical question because it's a question in many ways that was not being debated and discussed in an intense way in the 18th century, and it's come out of our 21st century culture wars and has been sort of superimposed now on the founders in a way that they weren't thinking about it that way. So that's what I mean. That's one example of how, how do we think about the relationship between the past and the present? And there, I think historians and the way historians think, might muddy the waters a bit, and it won't just be such a clear cut. We aren't a Christian nation. Or the founders, I hate when people say the founders believed, right? The natural inclination of a historian to say, okay, which founder? Right. You realize these people argued all the time. Like they even argued over the Constitution, right? Some of them walked out of the Second Continental Congress because they couldn't sign it, right? Because it was too radical or something like that, or they didn't want independence. So all of these things are all of these things make history really messy and somewhat, it can be hard to relate the past to the present. So for me, I think I would like this year, certainly we want to kind of talk about the 18th century and all these things. We want to celebrate when celebration is necessary. We want to lament when lament is necessary, if we're being honest about history. But I think one of the things I hope, and I say this everywhere I go, is that the 250th would also help us to think about, and again, this is a hard sell in churches, right? But methodology and how the past relates to the present.
So for those of us that do preaching and teaching, that question, right? How do we have a responsible engagement or responsible use of the past? I think can be helpful for us to meditate on. Certainly sermon illustrations, allusions, right? Things of that nature. We might reach back and pull out some story about, George Washington having, praying at Concord or something. And so you're helping us think about responsible engagement with the past, with our history. What are maybe a couple of examples that you see pastors maybe drifting into that would be less than wise uses of history? And then how would you coach us on some wise uses as we think about our preaching and teaching?
Well, I think again, this whole idea of a usable past, right? The illustration you gave about George Washington praying, right? Why does a pastor choose that illustration? Because they want to make some kind of point about how we are a nation founded on prayer, or at the beginning, people, the founding father of our country was a Christian of some type, or, so I think I think pastors need to come when they want to use illustrations like this or think about the past. They have to think more critically about, is this story I'm using historically accurate? Does it reflect the reality of the 18th century and what went on in the story? Or am I just using, is it more convenient that I get my point across in the present in this sermon, regardless of, whether or not the story is accurate? The story, say, of George Washington praying at Valley Forge is a very moving story. It's going to move people to be enthusiastic about their country, about the religious, so-called religious roots of their country, and it might, it might make people really feel really good about being Americans as they exit church. First of all, I'm not sure the responsibility of church is to make people feel really good that they're Americans when they leave, right? That's a whole other podcast, right? but it might make them, feel better about their country and so forth. But it's a largely inaccurate story, right? It really didn't happen the way that the images, the paintings that you see. I think this Rededicate 250 movement, we're talking again in May, a couple of weeks, they're going to all gather. Conservative Christians are going to gather on the Mall in Washington, D.C. and pray and have a day of thanksgiving and prayer. And the theme they're using is Washington kneeling next to his horse, the image on the publications and promotions. If you're a pastor, you might say, okay, maybe it didn't happen. Maybe you historians like Fea, are kind of thorns in our side. You're always picking on these things and so forth. But the story does the job, right?
Yeah.
Well, to me as a historian, that's an issue of integrity, right? I mean, it's an issue of, why would you tell a story that is not true to achieve whatever ends you want to achieve, which are largely, again, I would say, kind of patriotic ends that don't belong in a church anyway. So that's the sort of framing your question in a kind of different way. I mean, there's all kinds of examples in which this happens. Again, the praying at Valley Forge is an example of this. you have all kinds of stories about, you hear these stories about the so-called Black Robe Brigade or the Black Robe Regiment. I don't know how many of your, if you or Nap have heard about this, but it's if you Googled that word, Black Robe Regiment or Black Robe Brigade, you would find complete websites devoted to this. The Black Robe Brigade is portrayed in the 21st century as a group of patriotic pastors who preached politics. Now, what I mean by politics is they preached the American Revolution, rebellion against England, from their pulpits. That is preaching politics. Today we think about preaching politics as, saying who to vote for or something, right? But the American Revolution was a political movement. It was not a Christian movement, right? It wasn't like they, so they would preach these very patriotic kind of preaching independence from their pulpit. There's this famous story, there's no evidence to suggest other than some 19th century storytellers of a pastor, I think in Virginia, named Frederick Muhlenberg, who preached a sermon on patriotism and then ripped off his black clerical gown, and underneath was a military uniform, and then he led a militia into battle, right? I mean, that's a story. It could have happened, but it's just the only evidence we have of that story comes from a relative of his who wrote a book in, the 1830s and 40s to praise. So this Black Robe Regiment, for example, has become, you have, if I can name names, you have people like the megachurch pastor in California, Jack Hibbs, who has really run with this story. You have, of course, David Barton and some of the other so-called Christian nationalists who use the past to sort of peddle their political agendas using this story. And the modern day manifestations of it is that we need to be the Black Robe Regiment again. Hibbs actually goes up there with a black robe sometimes and preaches. There was a Black Robe Regiment. The phrase comes from Peter Oliver, who was a loyalist tax collector in Boston who complained about all the ministers who were preaching politics from the pulpit in Boston. And he used that word, the Black Robe Regiment. What the modern day Black Robe Regiment doesn't say is the things that Peter Oliver were complaining about were not only these preachers preaching politics from the pulpit, but they were also telling their congregations to go burn down buildings, to tar and feather tax collectors, which is physical violence, right? Tar and feathering, you spread hot tar on a person, which creates second to third degree burns, and then you dump feathers on them, right? These are the things that are being preached by the Black Robe Regiment, to go out there and be activists for the cause of these political things, which often led to violence. So that's a long example I'm giving you, but it's certainly another one that you see a lot of pastors today finding a usable past, right? That pastors are trying to find to promote their political and social cultural kind of agendas. So, no one's interested in the more nuanced story that I just told. No one's interested in the complex story. No one's interested in the fact of saying, like, well, maybe George Washington did pray, but that picture, be careful because it's not true, the painting, or whatever. And we built an entire sort of cultural movement around that painting, right? Or political movement around that painting. No one wants to preach nuance because nuance doesn't sell very well from the pulpit.
Right. That's
it doesn't move people, right? It doesn't appeal to the passions of your congregation.
Yeah.
The other thing is, right, my take is, look, if I'll give you an example of a student I had about 15 years ago. I was talking about religion and the founding in a lecture. It was a course on the American Revolution, and I devoted a little time to this question because I taught Christian students for 25 years, and a lot of them had come up in churches that, had certain Christian nationalist tendencies when it came to history. So I got done explaining how, the story of Christianity and the revolution is very problematic. People, historians are going to manipulate. Present day people, pastors and politicians are going to manipulate the past in order to advance an agenda and so on and so forth. I gave this whole spiel. So this student comes up to me. He was a history and political science double major. Comes up to me afterwards and he goes, "Man, Dr. Fea, after what I just heard from you, I wanted to go into politics as a Christian. I wanted to be a Christian presence in the political world, and now I don't think I can." I was like, "Why not?" "Well, you say we're not a Christian nation." I was like, what are your views? I kind of knew what they were already. Like, what do you want to fight for? Well, I want to fight for pro-life. I want to fight for, traditional values, traditional marriage, family value, right? All these things. I said, well, go into government and fight for those things. But don't do it because America was somehow a Christian nation and, our history is Christian and we need to reclaim that founding. No, you go into these political spaces as representatives of the kingdom of God and fight for the beliefs you believe are biblical and just, right?
That's good.
And then, whatever the issue is, doesn't have to be those sort of traditional Christian right kind of values. It could be like justice or sometimes you see the left, right? They're fighting for social justice or for the environment and so forth. And it's because we're a Christian nation, we need to do that. Because we were founded as a Christian, no, just go do it, right?
Right.
And sometimes history, is not going to be helpful on that, right? Kind of thing. So there's another kind of more kind of macro example of
that's good.
The way we should think about these things.
That's so good. So as we're thinking about guiding our congregations, how can we learn from our history? Give us some coaching on healthy ways to engage our past and also how to talk about it to our congregations.
Sure. The first thing is so over the years, I've done a lot of speaking in churches. And what I've found is a lot of mainline churches, more left of center churches, they're glad to have me come in, right? They think I'm going to criticize the Christian nationalists, so they want to have me in. But even more importantly, these churches have a space. They sometimes refer to it as the adult forum, on Sunday morning, like special topics kind of thing. They've created a space, and this is something about mainline Protestantism that I really like as an evangelical Christian myself, right, who does not attend a mainline church. But they have a space where issues can be discussed from a Christian point of view, right? Whatever that Christian point of view. For them, it's usually a more progressive kind of Christian point of view, right? Sometimes it's really, really hard for me to even be invited. Like I rarely even get invited to evangelical churches. Number one, because this question of, say, religion and the founding is too political. Right? They don't want, they don't want politics in the church. And number two, they don't really have a space for this kind of conversation. That's not all evangelical churches, but most, right? So I think one way you could begin to help educate your congregation as a pastor is to create spaces for trusted, I'm not saying bring in any Tom, Dick, and Harry, to come in and talk about whatever issue. Right. But for Christian scholars, Christian thinkers, Christian authors who have addressed these political issues, it doesn't have to be American history or politics. It could be the environment. It could be, how to read better, how to appreciate literature better, how to think about, human sexuality or whatever. To create these spaces and even if there's some disagreement, right, to be a place where there could be kind of a modeling of this kind of conversation and civic dialogue. Evangelical Christians are not good at that because they're so conditioned when it comes to social and cultural issues by a culture war mentality, right? They're just there to fight, right? They're there to, I was watching this conversation the other day in a podcast between the podcaster Allie Beth Stuckey, I think is how you pronounce her last name, and David French. And it was supposed to be a dialogue, but it was basically like Stuckey kind of hijacking French on every single question, in this kind of culture war fortress mentality, right? She's, and so many people said it was such a great conversation. I thought it was a terrible conversation because she would not give an inch during the discussion with David French, a New York Times columnist who is an evangelical himself. So create those kinds of spaces, right? And then it doesn't have to be about, like, I used to teach classes in my church about how to engage faithfully in politics without ever mentioning the name of any politician. Right. Principles, ideas, here are some things you need to think about. So that's one, I think, in terms of the specific history dimension to this, right? I've been teaching Christian students for 25 years that there are key ways of thinking about the history discipline, the historical discipline, how to think historically about the world, whether you're a history major or history buff or not. And these are the so-called, I've talked about these many times, the so-called 5 C's, the letter C of historical thinking, right? Complexity, right? The 18th century world of the founding was a complex world, and we need to consider that when we go in there and try to cherry pick what we want, right? Causation, right? Why did things happen? You see this huge debate now over, how should we educate people in history, right? Or how should Christians read about history? Well, you just need to tell them what happened, right? You give them facts. A historian's always sort of taking it up to the next level, right? Why did these things happen the way they did, right? Change over time. This is a huge one because on this whole debate over Christian America, and this is the methodology issue I was talking about, this whole debate over Christian America usually goes something like this. I'm going to find quotes from the 18th century where John Adams says the Constitution was made for a religious and moral people, right? Yeah, that's true. He said that, right? Or George Washington in his farewell address said that religion and morality are the pillars of a republic. Granted, yes, Washington said that, right? But there's this kind of mentality, it's almost like the originalist version of how to interpret the Constitution that you see from conservative justices, like the late Antonin Scalia, or on the court today, Clarence Thomas, or Samuel Alito, right? It's this originalist view where you go back, you take the mind of the founders in the 18th century. Again, as a historian, I would say which founder, right? So it's already complicated. But you take the so-called mind of the founders as if their ideas were sort of frozen in the 18th century. And then you just carry them over to the 21st century, to 2026, and unthaw them. And there you have it, right? This is America. This is what America should look like. As if nothing happened between 1776 or 1787 and 2026. There was no change. America didn't change. The population is the same. The demographics is the same, right? No historian, sometimes this is referred to as law office history, right? You just find what you need in the 18th century, and then you somehow apply it to like a football game prayer or something like that. So change over time, complexity, causation, contingency, right? Why people make the choices that they make. History is about human activity, sinful humans, right? But human activity, not about like trying to figure out what God is doing. I believe in providence as a Christian. I believe God is providentially rules the world. But it's a terrible category for studying humans.
Right.
Because it takes away any kind of the mystery of God, right? All of a sudden you automatically know why that fog came up in August of 1776 to get George Washington across the river when he was pinned by the British at Long Island. It came across because God wanted to America to win, right? And we know that somehow, providentially. So, contingency says like history is made up of choices of individuals and so forth. And then I'm missing one, but it'll probably come to me later. Contingency, causation, change over time, complexity, and context, right? Thinking about these things, what was the context of the 18th century world? I mean, we hopefully preachers do this all the time when they study biblical texts and put it into historical context, right?
Yeah.
So this could work for preaching too, about the first century world, and what Scripture meant in the context of the time, and that may change the interpretation of just the kind of straight common sense reading of the text. Right? Words mean different things. Culture, practices, rituals mean different things. So, I wrote this book called Why Study History, in which I develop all of this. Pastors have actually found it to be very helpful. At least that's what they tell me. But so I just summarized a lot of things in that book in the last 5 minutes of this conversation. But I think these are the kinds of skills and intellectual habits, if you will, that a good pastor is going to have when they're going to address social and cultural issues, especially historical issues, and think about how those historical issues affect us today.
Yeah, that's so good. Good. Yeah, the context thing in my field, it's popular phrases. A text without a context is a pretext for a proof text.
There you go. Well put. Same thing in history. Same thing in history.
Yep.
And I think you see a lot with the so-called Christian nationalist view of American history. It's a lot of proof texting, right? Those quotes I mentioned before about John Adams and George Washington, lifted out of context, can be used in very effective ways to advance political movements in the 21st century, but they do not reflect the fullness and, back to another C, complexity of Washington and Adams' thinking on these issues.
Yeah, that's so good. So you're inviting pastors in the same way that we've been trained to think about the biblical text and to treat it with the respect, the complexity, the context, and also change over time as Scripture moves on. You seem to have some sort of progressive revelation that happens, and thinking about history in that way as well.
Yeah. Well, you interpret the old, right? Most Christian pastors, evangelical pastors, I know, interpret the Old Testament through Jesus.
Yep.
Right. Something changed.
Yeah.
Right. Over time. Imagine if you just took like the Old Testament frozen in time and dropped it in 2026. Next thing you know,
right.
you're killing Philistines and you're eye for an eye and all of these kinds of things.
Oh, that's right on.
So there's a perfect example of it in terms of the way but why do we then think about the founding of America differently? Because I think it's because we've been so culturally shaped by these ideas of rights and freedom and American greatness and exceptionalism and so forth that it skews the way we think about these subjects.
Yeah, that's good. So just as we conclude our time together, if you were to imagine you were at a coffee shop or a gathering with a dozen younger pastors, and you were asked to give them some encouragement as we are in this 250th birthday and also an election year, where we're going to be in a media environment where a lot of Bible gets thrown around and our people are hungry for guidance. What encouragement would you give to those pastors?
I would say we're living in a moment where doing what we've talked about in this podcast from the pulpit on a weekly basis, right, requires a certain degree of courage, I think, especially in evangelical spaces, because I think the evangelical church is being so formed by things like Fox News and the silos of social media and so forth. I mean, you've probably heard this, Caleb, before, right? It's almost as if pastors have little chance anymore. You know, they get the people once or twice a week, and Fox News is playing literally all day in some of these households. So people are being formed to be in this kind of political Christian nationalist kind of way by the media they consume. And thus it's going to require pastors to have some degree of courage. Now, I think you also have to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves here, right? You know, pastors know their context. Pastors know, it's one thing to just kind of be this prophet, right? Who, talks about like, we are not the kingdom of God is not America, or some fiery, I mean, you have to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. You have to be able to understand what your congregation can take and how much of it they can take on this kind of stuff. But it all comes down to, right, for pastors, what are you preaching? Are you preaching the kingdom of God, right? Are you preaching this alternative kingdom to what politics and the nation offers, right? Aliens and strangers, these kinds of things. And you could do this in a non-kind of, Stanley Hauerwas kind of radical way, right? That's a Christian idea, right? Or are you sort of allowing this, first of all, there's some people who are just overtly like allowing the nation to the American ideals to permeate and mesh and fuse with their Christian theology. I think most evangelical pastors, though, are trying to sort of think deeply about what a kind of good patriotism or a good love of country looks like, as well, in a context in which we are not citizens of this world. So I would say history, again, this is probably not from the pulpit, but in these kind of spaces, I hope people will. History is a great way of kind of getting Christians in the pews to think about these things, because it doesn't always come across as like offensive, right? It's not like preaching politics or you're showing them texts. You're saying this is what these people said. Here's what David Barton or someone else, I don't know if I'd even do that because that immediately raises red flags, right?
Yeah.
But here's what some are saying. Let's look at the documents, right? Here's also what Adam said, religion and morals are good for a republic. Here's also what he said, right? Here's some other ways of thinking about it. And it's not offensive as much because you can make your points without kind of being in their face and so forth, right? That's why I love being a historian. You can lay out the facts of what happened, and then even just the facts can oftentimes trigger sort of the moral or political imaginations of listeners and say, I always thought, okay, but it's right here. I can see the document. So the Christian right is very, very good at this, but they, pulling out documents and quotes, look at the text. But they don't bring these kinds of historical thinking skills to bear when they do it, because they're mostly in the business of not educating, but engaging in using the past for politics.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good, John. Thank you.
I go to
so
churches
much.
all the time, so if any pastors want, hit me up.
Yes. Well, that's excellent. So, where can people find you and your work?
Yeah, sure. I blog every single day, and I've been doing it for the better part of almost 19 years.
Wow.
At a blog called The Way of Improvement Leads Home. We'll need a whole other episode for me to explain what that title means. But if you want to shoot me an email, I'm happy to explain what The Way of Improvement Leads Home means. But yeah, you can. I just moved over to a new blog site. So I think the best way to do it, I can't remember what the URL is, but the best thing to do is just Google The Way of Improvement Leads Home. There you can find out all about me, where I'll be speaking, where I'll be, what I've been writing about, but also kind of daily roundup that I do of the evangelical world. I do it as a kind of scholarly practice to kind of keep develop a kind of curated, almost museum, if you will, an archive of what evangelicals are saying about the world of politics. So you can check me out there.
Yeah. And also you can find out how to contact John to come and speak at your church about these very important issues.
I'd love to. I'm not just kidding about that. I mean, I'm deeply committed to getting the church to think more deeply. And here at the Lumen Center, that's now part of my job description, doing these kinds of things. So happy to do it. Love being in churches, love meeting pastors and everyday Christians, who go to church.
Yeah, love that. John, thank you so much, man.
Hey, thanks for having me. You guys keep up the good work.